I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Anne Caroline Klein. Anne, also known as Lama Rigzin Drolma, is professor and a former chair in the Department of Religion at Rice University, where she developed a contemplative studies concentration for graduate students and teaches courses on Buddhism and Tibetan. She is also a Lama in the Nyingma tradition and a founding teacher at Dawn Mountain, a center for Tibetan Buddhism. She just published a book titled Being Human and a Buddha Too, which explores the wonder of living in more wholeness than in fragmentation. Her other 7 books include Knowledge and Liberation on Buddhist distinctions between intellectual knowing and direct experience, and Meeting the Great Bliss Queen, contrasting Buddhist and feminist understanding of self, and Heart Essence of the Vast Expanse. In all these endeavors, her central theme is the embodied interaction between head and heart on the paths to wholeness. She also has a course with the Wisdom Academy online, connected to Longchenpa's 7-fold mind training, practical instructions for entering Dzogchen. You recently published a book, it just came out in August, called Being Human and a Buddha, Longchenpa's 7-fold mind training for a sunlit sky. And to be honest, there are so many things I wanted to ask you that are not contained in this book, but this book is so unbelievably rich, it's impossible to not just focus on this. So I really want to, go into kind of little drops of this richness. And before going into that, I wanted to ask you how you came into Buddhism, because you've had quite a path thus far.
I think the way life goes, you tumble into things, you tumble into it. And I definitely had a certain kind of orientation that I couldn't have described, when I was younger in high school and college, and kind of not really satisfied with what was in front of me in terms of, well, I loved college, actually. I was an English major, but in retrospect, at least, I was kind of thirsty, and I didn't know for what, and I didn't even know that that was true. But I did get my junior year abroad in college. We had been looking at maps and thinking about traveling during the summer. So there was a little bit of a sparkle there. But then one day it just hit me, I have to go to India. I have to go to India. And my friend sitting behind me in class said, "You can't go to India. It's 2 continents away." Because we were talking about hitching around that summer, and you can't hitch to India. So we didn't go to India that summer, and I came back and I just felt, yeah, I really have to do this. And never mind that I don't know anything about India. There were no courses on Asia available in high school or in college. I managed to take Old Vedic 1 semester in college. That was as close as I could get. And I just decided I had to go to India. And long story short, I discovered that University of Wisconsin had a Buddhist studies program. I decided I should go to graduate school, just a little bit, a bare minimum to, honestly, to make a case to my parents why they should approve my going to India. And I had been an English major. I thought I would do comparative lit, and I applied and got into a couple of programs. But as I was grazing through catalogs, I saw that Wisconsin, which also had a comparative lit program, they had an Indian studies program. And that just was, wow, yes. And not only that, as part of that, they had a Buddhist studies program. And that just sounded like fun. I didn't know, really, I knew pretty much nothing about Buddhism. They're not like graduate students today. Maybe I had read Suzuki Roshi. I think, Beginner's Mind had come out around then. But there's nothing to read except Alan Watts, so I didn't know anything. And when I came there, between my 2 years there to get a master's, Jeffrey Hopkins, who was a 4th-year graduate student when I entered, had already got the chair of the department, Richard Robinson, who was the founder of it was the first Buddhist studies program in the US. And pretty much all the rest of them are children or great-grandchildren of this program. So the fact that Jeffrey came, he was one of the few people in the West who was fluent in Tibetan at that time, because he had stayed for 7 years at Geshe Ngawang Wangyal's, who you also were going to ask me to talk about. So he came to Wisconsin 3 years before I did, already fluent in Tibetan and having read quite a bit of Tibetan literature, able to translate. And he got Robinson interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and Wisconsin became the first place to hire. He hired Geshe Sopa, the first tenure track Tibetan hired there. And then they started Tibet House, what they called Tibet House. It was an old farmhouse in Cambridge, Wisconsin, about 40, 30 miles out from Madison, where nobody had ever heard of Tibet or the Dalai Lama. And he, through Geshe Wangyal, arranged for the former abbot of Jigme Monastery. Gyuta is the one with the deep singing. Jigme is the other. One of the two major tantra colleges in Lhasa. This was the one in Lower Lhasa. So he was Jigme Khyentse, the former abbot, which is, I don't know, kind of like being a former don of, I don't know, Princeton or Cambridge. I mean, it's like three in the Giluk hierarchy. It's like 3 rungs or so below the Dalai Lama. It's a very high position, meaning he was a great being, as he turned out to be. So he was 70. He was born in 1900. He was 71 years old when he came to Wisconsin. So he'd grown up fully in Tibet, and that was the end of Free Tibet, and he left and had been in France, I think, for a few years. And he came to live in this old farmhouse in Wisconsin, thanks to Jeffrey, who lived there also, a couple of graduate students who were interested in hanging out with a Tibetan, Lama, and Jeffrey, who wanted to study with him and did study with him daily for, I think, 2 years or so that we were all there. So Jeffrey taught a course on he started to teach Tibetan that summer because Khyentse was coming. And if you want to take the seminar with Khyentse, you have to study Tibetan. So, of course, he studied Tibetan. And, he's a brilliant lecturer, and he always was. And he started, lecturing about dependent arising and emptiness. And this makes so much sense. This is it. This is what I have to learn about, for the rest of my life. I have to figure out how to, have a life that allows me to do this. So there's a very strong aspiration, really, from the very beginning. I was really inspired. And then Khyentse came, and he was wonderful. And somehow I had a very easy relationship with him. And, gradually it became obvious to me that what I would do in India, which had been an open question, I would study with Tibetans as much as I could. And that's what I did. And it was wonderful. And, I've continued ever since. I stayed 1.5 years at that time. Was devastated when my visa wasn't renewed. Came back. Jeffrey started the program in University of Virginia eventually. So I went there just because he was going to continue to invite lamas, from actually selected by the Dalai Lama. And so we had the best teachers, and Jeffrey was just asked to write this up for Tricycle. So it's on my mind. Yeah, so those are the glory days, learning, and nothing was in English yet. So if you wanted to learn anything about Tibetan Buddhism, you had to have a translator, or you had to know the language, or a little bit of both. And that's how I got in. And then that just continued. I just continued to meet wonderful teachers and have including Geshe Wangyal, and, just have really, really strong relationships with them. Teachers.
Oh, gosh, there's so much in there I'd love to know more about. Maybe we could touch on now is that time in India. So when you were there for that first 1.5 years, what were you doing with the Tibetans? Were you taking courses or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything I could. We ended up in Sarnath. Harvey, who I also met in the program, he was a 3rd-year student when I was there, and he and Jeffrey and Elizabeth Napper were all in David Knipe's class my first semester. And so we all met. And Jeffrey started giving me advice from day one, pretty much. I was kind of lost. And he said, oh, read this, read that. So in India, let's see. First, we were in Sarnath. So Harvey and I both went to Sarnath. And I was looking around for somebody to teach me. And I met Dobam Tulku, now pretty famous for a while, head of the Tibet house in Delhi, who was a well-educated monk who wanted to learn English and knew just enough to help me. And we read Khenser. I begged Khenser to give me a suggestion of what to read because I had no clue. And he first didn't want to, and he said, well, read Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka Avatara. Okay, that was my goal. And we read like for 3 hours a day for, I don't know, quite a few months, 5 or 6 months. And formed a very warm relationship. He still regards me as his, first English teacher. And yeah, so I did that. And then we went to Dharamsala. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama had just opened the now, I think, pretty well, highly renowned, actually, Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. And I remember going there thinking, this could never amount to anything. It's just this little place on a hill in India, So I went to that class. Geshe Ngawang Wangyal taught that class. For many of the months that I was there, he taught Shantideva, Bodhicharya Avatara. He said, some of you may teach it in the future. And we all were like, no way, how could we possibly? And then had an audience with His Holiness, which is not so hard to do at that time. And His Holiness said that you should study with Geshe Rabten and with Longchen Rinpoche, who were both in Dharamsala at that time. So I did that. And I would go up the hill to class in the morning and then up the hill to Geshe Rabten. And then some days, at least, a little Longchen Rinpoche lived in the compound, His Holiness's compound. George Dreyfus, then a monk, translated for me. And one of Geshe Rabten's students, who now heads the Rabten Ling in Switzerland, translated for me. And so I walked up and down the hill every day and studied with all those people. And then Jeffrey came to India, and he was in Upper Dharamsala for a while, and I would stop on my way down after all my classes with my list of questions that I hadn't quite understood yet and talk to him. I was very, very happy time. Just a really happy time.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. And okay, so I won't get carried away in this. I really do want to, though. But we will get carried away a little bit also in your meeting with Adz.om Rinpoche, because that also really connects with this book and feels important to speak about him. So you met Adz.om Rinpoche in 1996 when you were going on a pilgrimage, a Longchen Nyingtig, I think, pilgrimage, which is your specialty, this area. Would you share about that pilgrimage and then as well your encounter with Rinpoche?
Maybe the two most significant things I've done in my life were because I just had to, for no real reason. First one was to go to India, and then I had been to Tibet a few times, and of course, I wanted to go to Tibet for a long time. I'd been to Tibet. First time I went was in 1987 as a tour guide for the Smithsonian. And I did that twice. And then the Smithsonian, we went to Samye Monastery, and you could see up Chimpuk, but the tours didn't go there. And so one day in the early 90s, so sometime after, I don't know, I just felt I have to do a pilgrimage to places connected with Jigme Lingpa and Longchen. We went up to Samye Chimpuk, which we had almost called, that was a big part of the purpose of the trip for me. I'd always wanted to go to Samye Chimpuk also, and now it was coming together. And we were 2 hours away from canceling it because a couple of people had altitude sickness and they were scared, and we couldn't find out how high it was. You'd think everybody would know, but nobody did. finally, somebody I didn't know called my hotel room, and he knew. He had just been there. He said, "You can go. You can go." So we were on a truck going up. The truck was full of our group, small group, and nuns, Tibetan nuns. She had a button. Somebody's face that I didn't recognize was on that button. I said, "Who's that?" She said, "Oh, great Lama, and he's here. And you can meet him." She told me where he was. So we went to meet him. Very quickly, we understood that he was a Lama from the Longchen Nyingtig lineage. And I asked, would he teach us? We didn't quite realize that there were a couple of 100 monks up in the caves that were coming down every other day for teachings from him. And there were a group of mostly nuns, monks and nuns from the caves, and monks and nuns camped around who were getting teachings from him on a daily basis too. And he said, "Well, would you like me to teach you individually or as a group?" What?
So generous.
So generous. And at first I was like, how could we ask? I couldn't ask. And then something was, no, we have to say, yes, please, one by one, if you will. You say, well, of course, everybody's different. How could you? And that is what I learned later, is that is actually how he teaches Dzogchen, one-on-one. I mean, there were a couple of hundred people. He was teaching Yeshe Lama, which is a very important post-Ngondro, practice text. In this tradition, he was teaching that to many monks. But he really, his semtri, his one-on-one, people call it pointing out instructions. That's really how he teaches Dzogchen. Mm-hmm. So that's what he offered each one of us, and myself and Michelle Martin. She was also on the trip and very fluent in Tibetan, and we both were there for his interviews. So he was just amazing. I'm sure he never met a group of 12 American women before. It was actually only his second time in central Tibet. So it was amazing that he was there when we were there. So it was a tremendous encounter. And before the interview started, his cousin read off the list of reincarnations that he is. Tresung Datesan, fifth speech emanation of Manchu Shri, on and on and on. And then Jigme Lingpa. And I just kind of passed out. Not passed out, but something completely just kind of collapsed. Here we were to Longchen Nyingtig, revealed by Jigme Lingpa. We met Jigme Lingpa our third day in Tibet. And we came back to him twice more. We were camping below. So it was an overwhelming experience, actually. I've never experienced anything like that. I mean, sitting in his presence anyway, but in this kind of situation, one-on-one, he would dial it up. and really was transformative. It was just transformative. There's a picture of me a few hours after I met him for the first time, and I really looked different. And I think probably we all did. There was something viscerally transformative. So he was my teacher by the time we left, and several of the other people too are still connected with him. So that's how it started.
I think you did say about Adz.om Rinpoche that he did have visions, right, of Geshe Sogyal. He's someone who's very visionary. And when you read stories about Jigme Lingpa, he had visions of Longchenpa that brought him the Longchen Nyingtig. And exactly. Will you speak of this visionary capacity, especially in the modern day, that we don't have faith in ourselves? And I know that it's not like anyone can just vision this person just because they want to. There's more going on there. But I just want to see if you have any thoughts on this visionary capacity that we often read about and, become inspired as practitioners.
Well, I think you're very wise to say that seeing it is kind of lights you up. Oh, this is what's possible. I mean, maybe not for me right now or this life, but it's possible. It's really possible. He's a Terton, so he has revealed quite a number of texts that, the way the tradition understands it, designated revealers find it and unpack it from their mind, because Yeshe Tsogyal placed it there at the behest of Guru Rinpoche. So there's somebody who is designated to find these particular texts. And such a visionary, it is traditional that there's such a Terton will receive during his lifetime a kind of list of what he, if things work out, it's never a done deal, that he may discover in his lifetime. And a couple of years later, I learned from Lama Dzogchen that actually he had received that just before we met. So there's something about that. To be around it is amazing. I have been around several of times when he has been writing or singing. It'll come and he'll sing. And if somebody's around, like in one case on Poto Island, he received a tear from Avalokiteshvara. Poto Island is sacred to Guan Yin, who is the Avalokiteshvara in female form in China. And he spent many hours that day just singing. And fortunately, there were 3 Tibetan students right with him, and they were writing the whole time. They were writing. So it got inscribed, and that has become one of a number of practices that we do. The Jigme Lingpa, it's called the Lotus Heart Essence. So that was a vision. At the end of the day, he said, I've just received the full Dzogchen teachings from Avalokiteshvara. Who knew Avalokiteshvara had Dzogchen teachings? And on Putu Island. And a couple different occasions, he was receiving something. I didn't really know what was happening. Or even if I had a sense he was receiving something, I had no idea what. But I just started crying. Not like sadness, just something just welling up, crying and crying and crying. And so it's very powerful to be around. And then when he teaches it, it's really powerful. It's very alive, which is what they say about tear. New tear treasures are, they're fresh. It's not like the other ones really get old. I mean, we still revere them, but it's like hot off the Akashic record or something. And also, sometimes when he was inspired in the middle of a teaching, he would just sing some beautiful verses. And if somebody was around to catch him, you wrote it down. Sometimes it got recorded, not usually. And it was exquisite poetry, just exquisite, exquisite poetry. And also, like sometimes we would just do it in a car. We'd be, in the back seat and somebody would be driving and we'd be somewhere. And he would just feel happy and start singing. And it just changed the whole atmosphere. Like even if he didn't understand any Tibetan, I don't know, it was like roses were blooming everywhere. Not visually, it's hard to express what that feeling was. It was a very rich, light feeling. Once we were in Methodist Hospital here in Houston, not a very romantic place, and he was getting some tests. He was in between, waiting for results, and he and I and Jason Ma walked around for a couple of hours. And he just started singing, and he said, I'll answer anything you want. Oh, this is a moment. And we started asking him, he was in the mood to give definitions for things. So what's the definition of wisdom? What's the definition of dakini? But I didn't have my phone. I didn't record it. And I understood it in the moment. I do remember listening very carefully to every word and realizing, this is amazing. This sounds so absolutely right. I haven't heard this before. But then the next one would come and it would leave my mind. So I remember that sense of just awe and joy. He had a vision of Yeshe Tsogyal that also resulted in an amazing treasure at Yeshe Tsogyal's birthplace, her Lhasa, where the water arose after she. Which is interesting. We went there right after we saw Rinpoche. We went there, and it was fantastic to be there after, very quiet, and we could maybe kind of absorb the amazing experience we had with him. And he also went there after. I mean, he stayed in Chimpo for some amount of time. I'm not sure how long, but after that, he went to Tsogye Lake. That was one of the times, at least, he saw her. He's talked about his conversations with Guru Rinpoche in Samye, in the middle, I think, the turquoise room. Yeah, we know this because there's also a Guru Rinpoche. The Guru Rinpoche and the Yeshe Tsogyal, and also a Terma practice, are part of what he calls the Longchen Nyingtig, a luminous heart essence. So that's another cycle of his tear. They're just amazing. We have something called the Dzogchen cycles, which has mostly been populated with his explicit direction by his tear in certain sequence. And Taramandla has especially been teaching a certain part of the Longchen Nyingtig. So that's what it's like. You feel like your teacher is just, reality is just pouring through him in every possible way.
Do you know much about the tradition of spontaneous song? And you're obviously giving us examples here.
Yeah. I mostly know what I know from that experience. I mean, it is highly respected in the Tibetan tradition, the great ones like Milarepa. It's a certain kind of state of entering, and I don't really know much historically. What I do feel about it is, so we have this Yeshe Tsogyal practice, for example, or the Avalokiteshvara practice. It's exquisite poetry, very, very distilled. So distilled that it seems very simple. But when he opens it up, or your practice opens it up, you can sit with a phrase, a word or two, for any length of time. And it's just like sucking on something extremely delicious and nutritious. And the more I've read in Longchenpa, particularly nowadays his Ching-Zi, his Precious Treasury of the Dharmadhatu, which Richard Barron translated as Precious Treasury of Basic Space, that's with the commentary, and reading various Dzogchen Tantras, which Longchenpa quotes, I see that these texts echo them. And so I see that one of the things I'm going to write in my next book about Yeshe Tsogyal is, and it's like it's an echo from the earliest days of Dzogchen in Tibet. And you can hear it and you can feel it. And I mean, I know specific passages that are like that, but I feel that even just saying that to someone, it just is a certain kind of feeling that's possible.
Yeah.
It's like all these voices are coming through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very visceral just hearing you say that sentence.
It's very visceral. Oh, thank you. It's the whole thing is very visceral. I mean, your body feels different. I mean, I think part of the joy of being around when he does that, I mean, something happens.
Yeah.
Something just happens and everybody feels it.
I can't wait for this book to come out. Yeshe, the echoes of earlier Tibet. In some time. Well, I want to read these two quotations from your book. So this is the first. The essential Dzogchen Tantra, reverberation of sound, says that no matter what kind of behavior one engages in, one never leaves reality, the Dharmata. And then the second one is, Longchenpa writes on this leaving nothing out by saying, self-sprung wisdom is the very essence of awakened mind. Stay right with it, and it shows up. So don't look elsewhere, look right there.
The inspiration of this kind of statement brings about some kind of confidence that you're on track, that you're going to be able to do it because you know what? It's right here. You can't understand that I mean, in a way, the book is the story of my totally not understanding that, but wanting to and never quite giving up. So I think the training is really important. And, for us, we encourage people to do Ngondro. Something's very special, though, about Rinpoche's tear when, who should we teach this to? And I thought he was going to say people who have done Ngondro, but he didn't. He said, to good people, to people who I interpret that to mean who have some kind of faith, in the Dharma, some kind of faith in themselves too, even if it's kind of overridden with lots of gunk, but still some kind of faith, some kind of trust. So you can taste what you can taste. People do get a lot out of them. At the same time, to really appreciate some of these statements, well, all I can say is it's taken me a long time and a lot of practice, to start to feel like, hey, yeah, this speaks to me. My experience, I don't feel alone, that this is really true. Or maybe it's true, but I don't really know where to look to find this in myself because I am so encumbered by whatever it is at the moment, anxiety, worry, pride, jealousy, just busyness, maybe more than anything. So I don't know where to look. And I feel that the practices that we have, including these tear, including Ngondro, the foundational practices, and especially guidance from one's own teacher, personal guidance, they do in time really show you that that's not all you are. There really isn't all you are. The worry, the fret, even the thoughts, it's not all you are. And maybe one easy way, I think very helpful way to understand this is that, sometimes if our motivation is strong and we've practiced a lot and we're held by good teachers, we can, even in very difficult circumstances, remember to look and just not be swept up and identify with it, but not push it away and just see it. And one way that sounds like a basic mindfulness practice, which it is, but from the perspective of, teachings on Buddha nature, teachings on the unstainable quality of your mind, everyone's mind, can kind of see that the ability to do that, already in that moment, right as you are, you're not getting better, you're still angry or hurt or in pain, but not all of you is. Not all of you is. And then from there, I think you can, maybe it's just the fifth Dalai Lama says, with a corner of your mind, have a look at what's going on. And using the lens that we receive through Jigme Lingpa and Longchen Nyingtig, we can see that that's already a kind of freedom. And then we can start to see that, yeah, that's a glint of Buddha nature. That's a glint of what's possible. Clouds pass through the sky always. Thoughts don't stop coming. Pain doesn't stop coming. But it doesn't hurt the same way when we are not identified with it. And with that, which I think is not so hard, although it does take practice to, have that kind of experience, this starts to make sense. Yeah. And it's all there in that mind, in that moment of clarity. Because what is it except a state of freedom from the things that usually obscure us? And they don't obscure us 100%, even when they obscure us. And so there really is a phrase that comes up again and again in the old tantras. It's in one of Rinpoche's tear, which I translated in chantable English as rest, neither erase nor place. Just rest. This word pep in Tibet, it means settle, just kind of. And there's nothing to do. And that starts to make sense the more it becomes believable and seeable that there really isn't anything. It is right there. It actually is. There's nothing to shove away. There's nothing to fix up. Very hard to believe. And, you're mentioning confidence in the beginning. It's really important. And I think that's what the word teba that gets translated as faith. I think what that really is a kind of confidence. Tuka Trundab translates it as trust. And I think it's the feeling of, yes, 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 for me too. I'm not the only one in the world without Buddha nature. The fundamental message is it is there. And if you practice and if you wait, as Nagarjuna says famously, if you churn milk, why, you will get butter one day. It just happens, right? If you practice, in the end, there's a lot of emphasis on knowing what to reject, what to take up and what to discard, right? That's core teaching. I'm translating my next book is Adz.om Rinpoche's commentary on Words of My Perfect Teacher. Adz.om Rinpoche talks a lot about the importance of what I'm translating as heartfelt confidence. That's how I translate it in the book. And Adz.om Rinpoche and Jigme Lingpa himself, this was a real through line for all of them. And it's exceptionally important to feel like there's something you can trust and that it's not naive. Part of me lives in academia, so you're always supposed to doubt and be suspicious and have something interestingly analytical to say, which has its purpose, but goes so far, And this trust is really important because it means you're porous to the teaching. And that as soon as somebody points to you maybe and shows you your Buddha nature, you're not going to go sputtering, but I can't, which was basically my reaction. Because you're porous. If somebody you really trust says, you know what, this is something true that I'm going to show you and tell you, you relax a little bit, and you have to relax. The relaxation is, you're not doing anything, and it's so fulfilling. I mean, we do have experiences that are rich, and they're rich because we're not doing anything. We're lying on a grassy, mountain valley, or floating in the ocean, or falling in love. And, you can't make yourself fall in love, but oh boy, it happens. So we know, if we're reminded, we have this capacity. We're not just our worries and our frets and the things that keep us awake at night.
Inspired by what you just shared, I also want to read this other quotation from your book. It's from the earlier part of your book. Here it begins. Are we humans practicing to be Buddhas, masquerading as humans, given that the ground of all human experience is reality? Is there even such a thing as merely human? In fact, the more I look into it, the more the question, can I awaken, starts to stand on its head. End of quote.
Well, I still believe that. As you read that, I was thinking, that's right. I'm even surer now that that's right than when I wrote it. Yeah, I think the more the question comes, can I not awaken? How could you not over time? You go to sleep, you're going to wake up. I think that there are Buddhas, many Buddhas masquerading as humans, most of our teachers probably. That's what Buddhas do, after all. That's what Shakyamuni did, and they've been doing it ever since. So that's very sweet. Buddhas are masquerading as humans, without a doubt. We're also masquerading as human because they may not know. We may believe the the costume, We're fooled by our own masquerade. For Dzogchen, this is really kind of the bottom line, literally. I mean, the ground, as Dzogchen, expresses it, is prior either to Buddha or sentient beings. There's a wholeness before either of that is configured. And Dzogchen, Dzog, as I say again and again in the book, Dzog means whole. It means complete. It means nothing's left out. That was a phrase in one of the quotes. Nothing is left out. The worst things about you are part of this encompassing unbounded wholeness that is your nature. And the sky is clear. The sky has poisonous clouds, even bombs, but you can't break the sky. You can't dirty it either. They can mess up the air, we know, but not the space itself. So everything is in one way, everything is in continuity. So the Buddhas are sort of in continuity with our own, the further end of our own development. But it's not just that. There wouldn't be that continuity if they weren't already inside of us. If we weren't already, as Zen people say so powerfully sometimes, if you see a Buddha on the road, kill him. Don't think that the Buddha is something outside of you, in other words. And the Tibetans really, so Longchen Nyingtig is saying the same thing. Don't look elsewhere. He says it again and again and again. And it's just like so poignant. Here we are rushing around. Rumi has this great image of people everywhere, desolate, desperate for a drop of water or something to eat. And this visionary is standing seeing this. And what he sees is just, trees laden with juicy fruit spurting out everywhere. This, I think, is a good image for how we are. We're looking for happiness in everything, but this thing inside that isn't really anything. And yet, as Longchen Nyingtig says, everything comes from it. We're materialists from the Dzogchen perspective. Once you feel incomplete, of course you feel you have to grab onto something, and then samsara.
You also speak about, in the mind training itself, you speak about the karmic narrative and the wisdom narrative. And will you talk about their relationship with each other? And then what does it look like in real life practice to work with these narratives?
To the extent that they're separate, to some extent they're separate. Karmic narrative is about the brokenness, what we call our brokenness, our afflictions, our troubles, our bindings, our repetitious samsaric hamster and a treadmill kind of way we do life. Feeling like we're the only person in the world, the best, the worst, the one around whom everything must, gather. So the karmic narrative is about that. And the karmic narrative is like, don't get over it, So, to the extent that you can, think about it. How happy does it make you to be greedy? Not really. Or obsessively compulsive about a clean desk. Or, which is not my problem, by the way. But there has to be a certain degree of willingness to accept that this is how I am right now. Not all of me, but plenty of me is like this. And I think that Dzog of Dzogchen is an invitation to do what we also do in basic mindfulness practice, is just observe it. Yes, this is it. I had this terrible, terrible, terrible reaction. And I said this terrible thing to somebody. They may never forget it or ever forgive me. And I did it. And I did. And it was really bad. But seeing it is the start of holding it. And in that seeing, ultimately, the wisdom narrative makes itself known, because there is wisdom in that seeing. And there is an oceanic quality to the wisdom narrative. The wisdom narrative is you, from the very beginning, even before separation into Buddha and sentient being, there is this triadic nature of everything. Everything is empty in essence, luminous in nature, and responsively generous, the world. That's the three kayas. Those are the seeds of the three Buddha kayas. And they're already here. Whether you're a Buddha or a sentient being, or somewhere in between, that's there. That's a given. For Dzogchen, honestly, it seems to make a lot of sense. We learn, early on, everything's empty, everything's dependent arising. And then the mind is luminous. Buddha said that a long time ago. And, that's been refashioned or rewoven into Dzogchen teachings and amplified more than it was in the early teaching, but it's not new. Some of the Nathaniel Rich is one of our Sangha and friends and teachers at Stone Mountain, and is a senior editor in the 84,000, and he's always coming up with sutras that sound an awful lot like Dzogchen. So that's the wisdom narrative from the very beginning. There's a wisdom narrative, and in Dzogchen, it's really, really amplified. And the relationship, I think for a time, they seem like two narratives, but they sort of start to come together. And I play with images in my mind because I think the wisdom narrative is somehow always inside the karmic narrative. But the metaphor doesn't work so well. Maybe like some parts of the ocean, there's a river running through it. There's a place in California, in Northern California, a river meets the Pacific. Another way I think of maybe the metaphors work, that the karmic narrative is like a river to the ocean of the wisdom narrative. It is that it takes you there. It's not like going in some other direction. And I feel that that's a very simple way of saying a lot of how the tradition is so brilliant. If you find, you are wanting in some way, and who doesn't? I mean, why else do we take up practice? Okay, the Karmic narratives helps us with that a lot, and helps us with practices and tools and understandings. Yeah, okay, and gives us the courage to recognize, well, this is it. I'm not that great in this particular area. In fact, it's kind of terrible. Oh, Vajrasattva, help me, and Tara, help me. We learn how to get help for these things. And then the wisdom narrative is, of course, you can get help, because this is just about finding out who you really are. You've always been. Adz.om Rinpoche, whenever he gives a wang, he begins by saying, you couldn't receive this if you didn't already have it. And that's so wonderful. Like you're already in the club.
Yeah.
Thank you for picking out these particular quotes and these particular themes. I mean, I feel they're profoundly important and profoundly delicious also.
Yeah, they really are. Actually, one thing I want to talk about that just kind of continues from this is you talk about Tantra and imagination, and you say this, which I really love. You say it's ritually choreographed performance of transformation, which includes the senses, the emotion, and the body. And you ask, is it possible to attain something that we have not yet imagined? Then you go on to say, quote, what is prayer but an opportunity to imagine, and then to feel that something more is possible, not a guarantee, a possibility. And will you speak about imagination's place in realization?
Well, imagination is a very, very important part of practice. We have to be able, and we are invited, as you know, in very specific ways in practice, to imagine that we're succeeding, that we're Tara, that we're Yeshe Tsogyal, we're Guru Rinpoche, and we look like them, and we feel like them, and we walk around like them, and we move like them, and that's imagination. I think I want to make a distinction between a trained imagination. Imagination is not daydreaming. It's really learning how to focus attention on a distinctly described possibility. It's not like, oh, I'll be a Buddha. It's like, no, I'm green, and I have one head, and I'm holding a lotus, and it's very specific performance, right? Performing it. You're performing your Buddha nature in those practices. Actually, Geshe Ngawang Wangyal, the Khyentse who lived in Tibet House way back when, one of the first things he said in our first class, when he actually started teaching a class in Madison, he gave detailed instruction on the sevenfold posture. He's one of the most brilliant philosophical minds of his generation. And he said that because when you sit that way, you inspire others, and you inspire yourself. And that's where he started. So that's the beginning of imagining that you could have a literally different posture in life. People are enormously creative, and creativity is the ultimate creator, really. I mean, for Dzogchen, for creativity creates. It's reality that's creating. It's Samantabhadra. Of course, it's described in different ways, but the possibilities are infinite. This is one of the things that Longchen, among others, likes to elaborate, that anything can arise. Why can anything arise? Because there's no actual there. And it's not going to be an actual thing either, but it can arise. These people, the Tibetan pantheon is just so, what can you say, richly imaginative. Okay, maybe it comes in dream, but that's imagination too, especially a yogi's dream, So I think imagination is a place where we can first taste enormous freedom. If you can give yourself permission, which might not come easily, to really feel that you're Tara or whoever, that's a lot of permission. Not just green, but made of light. No real, bird could fly through you. You're just made of light. If you can start to feel yourself, even for some moments that way, then maybe you're already just not quite as stuck in present ordinary perception. I mean, that's what books say, that, imagining yourself and as a deity and saying the mantra protect you from ordinary experience. And I heard that hundreds and hundreds, heard or read it so many times and parroted it myself many times. And I feel I'm finally starting to realize how very true it is. It really does. It substitutes for your ordinary mind, more and more. And we can say that it's imagination, but I don't mean imagination in a kind of pejorative sense, like you just made it up. I mean, everything is just made up. And this is at least intentionally made up for a clearly defined pedagogical purpose, So the imagination, it's very important. Where would we be without it? You have to be able to imagine that you can change. You have to be able to imagine that you could reduce your anger eruptions from 10 times a day to 7. His Holiness said that once in a talk he gave at his first visit in 1977 to the University of Virginia, sitting on Jeffrey Hopkins' basement floor that we made into a temple for his visit. And I thought, that was an incredible thing to say. He said, if you've been practicing for 5 years and, it diminishes by, say, 30%, congratulate yourself. Because it's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight, as we longtime practitioners know. But I think when you start, you feel, oh, I'll be another person in a few months, and whoa, won't that be a relief? Yeah.
So beautiful. So you mentioned your longtime teacher. We've been alluding to him since the beginning.
Geshe Ngawang Wangyal. Yeah.
You say that existential paradoxes were a specialty of his. And like in declarations, for instance, like this one, stop pretending. Will you tell us about his background? Because it seems quite unusual, and how his presence affected your view on reality.
Made me feel I could survive. I guess. His story is remarkable. Joshua Cutler and his wife, Diana Cutler, have been working for decades on his biography. I think they're kind of close. And there's a fabulous article in Tricycle a few years ago by the now very recently late David Urubshira. So Geshe was born in Kalmyk country, so in Russia. They were persecuted by Stalin when they were in Russia. And so they left for what is now sort of Kalmyk country outside of Russia. And they're Tibetan Buddhists, they have been. Geshe was born on the Caspian Sea. So he grew up speaking Russian. And so he's part European. And his teacher, Dorjev, very famous, not to be confused with Gurdjieff, although some people have wondered, but I don't believe so. Dorjev, very famous Russian, and saw something in him and said, you need to go to Tibet and study. And Geshe went and said he didn't really have any interest himself in becoming a Geshe, but his friend wanted to. And so he stayed with his friend in Drebung, Gomang. His college was Gomang College. And he ended up, I believe, staying in Drebung for 25 years and later crossed the Gobi Desert at least once. He was in China during the Sino-Japanese War. He's kind of like the Forrest Gump of that time in history. And he was the first trained Geshe, the first Tibetan trained Geshe to arrive in this country in I believe it's 55. I could check. I think I say it in my book, 50, because the Karmic community, who were expats from Russia because of Stalin and were living in Freewood Acres, New Jersey, got permission to invite a priest. So Geshe came, and he was part of that community, built a monastery, which is still there in Freewood Acres, and then eventually built what he called his retreat house in Washington, New Jersey. And that was where I met him. And he allowed, it always seemed like he allowed and you were barely permitted. Maybe you could stay for a while, especially me, who he said I had not received permission to come. He said it often. It was terrifying. On the other hand, there was really good food. Somebody was pulling out one day as he was saying, you have no permission to be here. And I'm like, is he going to send me off in that car? Because there's no way to leave. There's no bus stop. There's nothing in walking distance. Somebody would have to drive me somewhere. Is he going to? And I'm sure he could hear the car door slam like I could because his windows were open. And I thought, I'm not going to say anything. If he doesn't tell me to get out, he didn't say anything. But that was like, what do you mean I don't have any permission to be here? I had written a letter. That's what I mean. He helped me through existential, but somehow I stayed. And years later, 12 years later or so, when I left really to go to school, back to UVA to start my PhD program, he turned to one of his older students and he said, so I was kind of saying, goodbye to this part of our relationship. I won't stay here for long periods anymore. He turned to Debbie and he said, from the beginning, I always liked her. So, existential, like, there are other stories like that. He was very interesting. He was more like what you read about, like a Zen master. We cooked with him. Sometimes that was the main thing we did. And you just always felt your life was on the line somehow. He was amazing. And Joshua's book, when it comes out, whenever that is, you should interview him about Geshe. Sadly, David just died last week, but he wrote amazing. He was Kalmic himself, David. He was a maybe amateur, but very, very wonderful historian. He was a great storyteller, and he would tell us stories about the old days, Kalmic country, and how the people moved from here and there. Yeah, he was an unusual person.
Yeah, it sounds like he was always trying to get you wherever you would be insecure. I mean, just from the stop pretending even, it's like the worst thing to hear from somebody you respect.
Right. Yes, exactly. I would say that's correct assessment.
But the wisdom way.
There was always love underneath it. That was what was amazing to me. He scolded me a lot. And, I mean, I didn't like being scolded, although it didn't mean I got a lot of attention, I guess. I certainly didn't feel like I was being ignored. And, I would think, what is it? I'm not unhappy. I'm not depressed. I don't feel like, being a person very sensitive to criticism, you really get, but he was being, maybe because he was being so upfront with his criticism, I could just whereas people that you suspect are thinking things that they're not saying. I don't know. I don't know. But he was very loving, actually, also under that. And the food food is love. He was an incredible cook. And it was a lot. When he wasn't scolding me, it was a lot of fun. It was actually a lot of fun to be there.
Mm-hmm.
I should say that one of the things that is coming out as we look back in the history of Tibetan Buddhism coming, he was very important.
Mm-hmm.
Jeffrey Hopkins and Bob Thurman, his first generation main students, and all of the programs and students that they produced, just the two of them alone. And then he kept inviting geshes from India to stay at the retreat house. And after a few years, they would leave and start their own centers, which he would always be annoyed at. But in retrospect, he's the seed of many centers that initially the founders came through him. So he's a pivotal figure, actually, in the history of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism coming to this country.